We're excited to have you join us for the Come Follow Me 2021 podcast and study of the Doctrine and Covenants. Hosted by Rod Meldrum and Jonathan Neville. And presented by Gospel Doctrine Answers. In today's podcast, we study Doctrine and Covenants Section 1. Hearken, O ye people.
Welcome, everybody. We are beginning a new year here with 2021 coming in, and our study for this year is going to be the Doctrine and Covenants and the Pearl of Great Price. So we're excited about this. As many of you probably recognize right here, we have my dear friend Jonathan Neville. He's our resident church history expert, and we're excited about having him join us. So again, this is the Come Follow Me manual for this year. Our assumption is that you are going to go through the lessons yourself, and we are going to just take certain topics from the lessons, and then drill deep. Basically, have additional information, insights, maybe talking about the background story, what's going on at the time when these revelations are being discussed, and hopefully, if all goes well, we'll be able to give you further insights and in-depth information that will enhance your study of the Doctrine and Covenants this year. Yep. So to start off with, if we go right to the Doctrine and Covenants itself, we have the introduction. Basically, it's a collection of divine revelations for us, for our day. Mm-hmm. And I think that's kind of an interesting point to make, is that unlike most of the other scriptures that we have in the standard works, most of them had to be through this process of translation, or from the Greek into and then ultimately into English, or from Reformed Egyptian on the gold plates here into the Book of Mormon, and there was a translation involved. One of the things I love about the Doctrine and Covenants is that basically there was no translation, so it's pretty much as just the straight words from the Lord into English, and so we don't have to worry about concepts like did they get the translation right? Right. Is it given to from the Lord directly to His prophet Joseph Smith? Most of the revelations that are in the Doctrine and Covenants, with the exception of a few in the very end, were pretty much received through the prophet Joseph Smith Jr. Mm-hmm. And so this is really a compilation of that. And Jonathan's going to tell us a little bit more about the history of how these were put together and so forth. And then we'll talk a little bit more about that. But he talked about, and this is about the fifth or sixth paragraph down in the explanatory introduction in the beginning of the Doctrine and Covenants. It says, in the course of time, Joseph Smith was enabled by divine assistance to translate and publish the Book of Mormon. In the meantime, he and Oliver Cowdery were ordained to the Aaronic priesthood by John the Baptist and so forth, and this is in May of 1829. So this is covering quite an extensive period of time here. To me, on the one of the most important things here is it says, in the Revelations, the doctrines of the gospel are set forth with explanations about fundamental matters, it says. Like the nature of the Godhead, the origin of man, the reality of Satan, the purpose of mortality, the necessity for obedience, the need for repentance, the workings of the Holy Spirit, and the ordinances and performances that pertain to salvation, the destiny of the earth, the future conditions of man after the resurrection and the judgment, and the eternity of the marriage relationship and the eternal nature of the family. These are all fundamental things that are really unique to the restored gospel of Jesus Christ. Right. So we have the testimony of the 12 apostles and so forth about the Doctrine and Covenants, kind of similar to the witnesses of the Book of Mormon. And then there's also the chronological order of contents, and this lesson is lesson number 1. So this is about the basically Doctrine and Covenants section 1. That's right. and interesting enough, section 1 actually wasn't received for quite a while after many of the sections had already been received. Right. And then Joseph Smith decided, okay, we're going to start to compile these together and so forth. But then that section 1 wasn't received until basically November of 1831. Mm-hmm. But he started receiving these revelations and recording them down clear back in September of 1823. So that was about 8 years of revelations that had never been published or anything, and then they were in Hiram, wanted to actually get these things published so more people could know what these revelations were, and that's what was going on there. I wanted to. I have one other little thing that I wanted to do in the beginning, kind of just to set the proper mood here.
Okay. All right.
Because this whole year is going to be, to a large extent, it's going to be a lot about Joseph Smith.
Right.
And what he gave to all of us, basically his contributions to our knowledge about the gospel. And I had there's a beautiful song that was written by my friend Nathan Osman. I play it at a lot of different presentations that I've done around the country and around the world, but basically it's called A Little Boy's Prayer.
Okay.
And I just want to play this real quick here, and we'll get into it.
Joseph learned that he could ask of God. So he went to the woods, knelt down on the ground, and opened his heart to the Lord. A light descended, and Joseph saw the Father and the Son. Angels appeared, truth was restored, and wagon wheels crossed the plains. Apostles and prophets now walk the earth. God speaks to man once again, and families can be together forever. Temples are found everywhere, and it all started with a little boy's prayer. This is my beloved son. Joseph's mission had just begun. He listened to and obeyed the Lord's commands. Though hated, he could not deny what he beheld with his own eyes. Praise to the man, he endured to the end. The world is forever changed. Angels appeared, truth was restored, and wagon wheels crossed the plains. Apostles and prophets now walk the earth. God speaks to man once again, and families can be together forever. Temples are found everywhere, and it all started with a little boy's prayer. Monks and demons could not stop him. The Lord stood by his side. He gave his life defending God's kingdom on high. Angels appeared, truth was restored, and wagon wheels crossed the plains. Apostles and prophets now walk the earth. God speaks to man once again, and families can be together forever. Temples are found everywhere, and it all started with a little boy's prayer. Yes, it all started with the little boy's prayer.
That is just beautiful. I love that whole genre, basically, with Joseph Smith, and how such great and marvelous things have happened because of this innocent young lad, really, and how God works with the weak and the meek to bring to pass His purposes. It's just really, really touching. All right, well, Jonathan is here, and so I want to have him kind of just tell us a little bit about, he's got some things that he wants to share here in the Doctrine and Covenants in Section 1. Go ahead.
Okay. Well, one of the things we wanted to explain what this first session is, because just like the Section 1 of the Doctrine and Covenants is a preface to the whole book of Doctrine and Covenants, this session today is the preface for the whole year's worth of podcasts.
Yeah, exactly.
Right?
Yep.
And so the lesson talks about D&C 1, and there's a couple of verses in D&C 1 that we'll be talking about in a minute. But Rod wanted me to kind of give you an overview of some of the things we will be talking about during the year, because I've collected a lot of church history related items and things that Rod wanted me to kind of go through. Like what? Okay. Well, for example, he talked about the Book of Commandments, which was the first publication of these revelations. And I have a replica here. You can see how big that is of the original Book of Commandments. And there's some interesting details about the Book of Commandments that we'll talk about in a few weeks when we get to that part of the church history. Also, I have here a replica of the first hymnal, which was in D&C 25. We talked about that, I think, the first week in March, if I remember right. And there's some hymns in here that we'll be discussing that are quite interesting. They're no longer in our hymn book today, but they played an important role in church history. So we'll talk about that. I also have a replica of the original Book of Doctrine and Covenants published in 1835. And I've made some notes in here that we'll discuss as well. But it's just interesting to see how these things were published in the early days of the church. Here's the comparison in sizes of them as an example. You can see these. And then we compared to a modern book today, for example, here's a kind of a book today. You can see how small these were. And the comment was made that it would be difficult to read these books because the print is pretty small.
So you have to be squinting hard.
And so people used to have to wear reading glasses, and I actually have a pair of reading glasses from the 1830s, give you an idea what they look like. It's one of my little artifacts here. Yeah. They have these little things that hang down that you fold up that go over your ears, but this is what they would look like. I don't find them very
Dr.
comfortable
Neville.
today. Yeah, exactly. One of the other little artifacts here I have is a scale replica of the seer stone that the church published pictures of in the Ensign a few years ago. And we'll be talking about the seer stone, the Urim and Thummim, the translation, and so on. Yeah,
translation process. It's such an important aspect that we need to know.
It's a hot item. There were at least 6 books I know of that have been published in the last year or so about the translation. And so we're going to be talking about that quite a bit in the next couple of weeks. I have here a replica of the point, the atlatl point that was stuck in the side of Zelph, which is part of Zion's Camp, and we'll talk about that in a few weeks when we talk about Zion's Camp, actually a couple of months. Yeah. Another one that's kind of cool, as long as we're talking about stuff, I have here one of as far as I know, there's only 3 of these. This is the entire Book of Mormon on handmade paper, just like the original 1830 was made. And many of you have visited probably the Grandin print shop in Palmyra, right? Yeah. And they give you the one sheet that has the cover on it and so on. Well, this is all of the sheets.
This is how many individual sheets it would have taken to print. To print. Basically, this. Yeah,
this
right here
set of paper would be cut to print a replica like this from the 1830 Book of Mormon.
After you get it all cut up, then that's basically what it does there. So this is a replica of the 1830 original Book of Mormon here.
Yeah, and there's several different versions of it. Yeah. I like this one the best because I like the color of it and the way it's written. It has the speckled paper and so on, like the ones, the original Book of Mormon. But I brought these to show you similar books that were published at the same time. Yeah. Like here's a Bible that was published in 1823, You can see it's about the same size. It's also leather bound. This is another book that was published, this is 1814. And this is a book of the writings of James Hervey, which plays an important role in the translation of the Book of Mormon that I'll explain later.
Look how old that is.
Yeah, it's over 200 years old. And it was one of the books that Joseph Smith donated to the Neville Library in 1844, but it was also available in Palmyra, 1818, 1819 timeframe. Mm-hmm. This is another book. This one's
just before the first vision.
Yeah, just before the first vision. This one was published in 1808, and it's one of a collection of 8 books in this volume by Jonathan Edwards. And later in these podcasts, I'll be telling you how Jonathan Edwards played an important role in the translation of the Book of Mormon also. Mm-hmm. So all of these are to give you, hopefully, a feel for what it was like 200 years ago when these events took place.
Yeah. I was just going to mention a couple other things right up here. Behind me here, I just pulled some things off of my personal library shelves, basically. Yeah. But these are just some of the reference material that I've kind of grew up with, actually. There's these books here. These are all church history books. There's 16 volumes of church history here. We have the new Saints books here. Saints book. These are Joseph Smith papers. I just brought a couple of examples here to kind of show you. This is the journals volume here and things like that. The paper of Joseph Smith is volume 2. This is a full set of the times and seasons, which tells us has a tremendous amount of history that was actually published back in their time frame. The history of Joseph Smith by his mother, Lucy Mack Smith. Other people who knew the prophet. There's hundreds of books about the prophet Joseph Smith. I just brought a couple of these just as examples. Teachings of the prophet Joseph Smith here by Joseph Phileas Smith, and then you have more modern day things like Brother Ridge's, basically his Doctrine and Covenants made easier, and then there's other materials here like the additional Doctrine and Covenant supplemental material here, and anyway, there's tons of different reference materials out there for people to find out more about this church history stuff.
And the problem we recognize is there's more material than anybody could possibly read, especially in 1 year or even in 1 week, right?
Yeah.
So here's the reason we're doing the podcast. You all have the lesson manual for Come Follow Me, which we're studying at home. Mm-hmm. If you look at each lesson, they're 1 or 2 pages is all. And the reason is, you can see this is the whole lesson. The reason is the lesson manual is intended to help us to apply these principles in our lives, to make us better people, to help us establish Zion, and to change the world, really, is why we're doing all this. And most specifically, as President Nelson says, so that we can hear him better. We want to understand the process of revelation in our lives, how the Lord can guide and direct us, and how we can better do his will and follow the things that he's asked us to do. And in order to do that, we thought that it would be important to have a resource, this podcast, that helps us to appreciate some of the background and what prompted these revelations. And also, I guess one of the most important things we want to do is reemphasize that what Joseph Smith and Oliver Cowdery taught is actually true, actually happened. And we've been concerned lately that there's been a lot of distancing of Joseph Smith and Oliver Cowdery on different topics. One of them is the translation of the Book of Mormon. And I guess we might as well get into that right now because it starts with D&C 1.
Yeah.
Right in Doctrine and Covenants 1, and there's several verses in here, but I wanted to focus on 2 of them in particular. Verse 24, I'll read it if you don't have it in front of you now. But it says, "Behold, I am God, and have spoken it. These commandments are of me, and were given unto my servants in their weakness, after the manner of their language, that they might come to understanding." Now that phrase, "after the manner of their language," is very important here, because after the manner of their language can be interpreted to mean, well, it was in English, right? As Rod mentioned at the beginning, these commandments were all dictated in English. And so that could be all it is. But there's another aspect of this that's important. The manner of their language is not just in English. It's the way that people spoke and their cultural context. So the cultural context for these revelations really was Christianity. Mm-hmm. And it was people familiar with the King James Version of the Bible. And that's how the Lord spoke to people. And throughout the Doctrine and Covenants, there are passages that draw from the Bible and from the Book of Mormon in some cases. But also not only the Bible and the Book of Mormon, this is one of the key points that I'll be bringing out, also from other Christian authors of the time that Joseph was familiar with. And I found many of these sections of the Doctrine and Covenants that are more the Lord and Joseph Smith interacting with what Joseph Smith had already learned from other people, other sources. And it's really cool to see it this way because it expands the whole Doctrine and Covenants. It's not just what the words are, but it's the whole context of it.
So how well do you feel that Joseph Smith knew, for example, the Bible?
Well, okay, that's a good point.
Because there's been people who've claimed, well, Joseph Smith had almost no education. He didn't even have, he didn't even know the Bible or whatever. Yeah. Address that for just a second.
I'll address that for a second. That's one that we're going to talk about more later in the year. Yeah, exactly. But for now, there's a very interesting event that happened, and I don't remember what year. It was like 1834, 1833, something like that. Someone came to visit Joseph Smith. I've written about it in my book here. But came to visit Joseph Smith and asked him about the restoration of the gospel. And Joseph Smith started by talking about what happened to him at a young age when he had his leg surgery. And that has always been a story in church history that we've focused on in terms of how brave Joseph was, how miraculous it was that there was a doctor there that could save his leg as opposed to amputate it and so on. But that wasn't what Joseph was talking about. He was talking about how the restoration of the gospel started back then. And so I started looking into it a little more, and I realized that after he had the leg surgery, his parents sent him with his uncle, his father's brother, back near Salem, Massachusetts, to be by the seashore because they felt like the seashore was had healing properties. Yeah. Which is why I've moved to the Oregon coast too.
Is it true?
It is totally true.
Yeah, your hair color's even coming.
We have people our neighbors there say they examine the entire United States and they found out that Oregon coast where we are is the healthiest place in the country. That's another topic. But it should be part of the word of wisdom, actually.
Thou shalt live in Oregon.
Yeah, thou shalt live in Oregon. But the point is that they sent him to live at the coast with this uncle who was a very devout religious Christian. And there's additional history about him. But I started wondering, I wonder if he was laid up in bed for several weeks.
He couldn't go out and play, obviously.
He couldn't go anywhere.
Couldn't even put weight on his leg.
What would he be doing, He would be reading. Even though he was around 7 years old, it's interesting that Parley Pratt brought up on his own separately that when he was 7 years old, he was reading the Bible and some of these Christian commentaries. We don't think today of a 7-year-old kid because all the 7-year-old kids are playing video games, right? But back then, these 7-year-old kids could be
they're pretty smart. These 7-year-old kids can basically manipulate computers and phones and so forth about as well as any of us oldsters can.
Right. But better than you can, I'm sure.
Probably.
Okay. But the other day I was playing a video game with my grandson who's not even 3 years old, and every time I would die, he just started laughing because he could get past those levels easily. Anyway, the point is that 7-year-olds in Joseph Smith's day could read. They could read the Bible. They'd been raised on the Bible in their families, and the Smiths were very religious. So he was conversant with the language of the Scriptures. And I found a series of 4 sermons for young men that were published in that area before Joseph went out there. And there's language and context in there that comes out in the Book of Mormon that I'll explain at some point. So it's really at an early age, Joseph was starting to learn about the Christian yearning for the establishment of Zion, the future Zion. And then later on, he said that he had an intimate acquaintance with the Christian ministers. He didn't really say Christian ministers. I think it was the teachings of these Christian ministers. And we'll discuss that. In fact, since Rod brought it up, I have this book here called A Man That Can Translate.
A brand new, just barely,
Yeah, it was published about 2 weeks ago.
A few weeks ago, yeah.
And it gets back to this issue of, did Joseph Smith translate the Book of Mormon or not? And that might sound like a silly question, but there are scholars in the church today who are saying Joseph Smith didn't translate it. And I'll give you an example.
He simply read off of the stone.
The seer stone. I'll give you an example right here. Yeah. There's a wonderful scholar. He's the best Book of Mormon scholar in the church named Royal Skousen. And he's written a whole bunch of these, several anyway, of these books in detail going through the Book of Mormon. In fact, I'll show you the one he did.
Yeah.
This is the original manuscript of the Book of Mormon. He went through and took all the fragments that we have of the Book of Mormon and
Which is only
transcribed
like 28%
28%
of it was
But he transcribed it into a
Nauvoo.
text here,
Yeah.
which you probably can't see too well, but we could provide a copy of it, I guess. But he went through each line that's available and transcribed it so we can read it today. And the Joseph Smith papers are in the process of preparing this for
Show the beginning of it. It shows the some of the fragments that are.
Oh, yeah.
That this is pulled.
Well, and the Joseph Smith papers
Yeah.
has some pictures of this in the papers, so we could give you a
Yeah.
link for that.
Yeah.
It's probably hard to see, but you can see.
There you go.
Here's a picture that shows some of the fragments and how the manuscript looks today. And so they have to use special photography, infrared, and so on to decipher what the writings were, whose handwriting it was, and so on.
Yeah.
So this is an awesome book, and the Joseph Smith papers are working on republishing this in the next year or two. I've gotten different dates from different people, but anyway, it's coming. We don't have it yet. But if you go to the Joseph Smith papers, there are, I think, 2 or 3 pages of it that you can read that have been transcribed. So that's awesome.
See how it is, yeah.
Then he also went through the printer's manuscript, and the Joseph Smith papers have published that, which is available. You can
And do
see
you want to
it.
explain the difference between the original manuscript and the printer's manuscript?
Okay, real quickly. We'll talk about this more in a few weeks when we get into the publication. But the original manuscript is the one that Oliver Cowdery and the Whitmer brothers and Emma actually wrote on. As Joseph dictated it, they wrote it down. Then, when they finished that, they made Oliver Cowdery and Martin Harris and Hiram a little bit.
Yeah.
Actually copied the original manuscript into a printer's manuscript so that they could take the printer's manuscript into the print shop.
In case it got stolen.
In case it got lost or stolen or damaged, they had a backup of the original manuscript. Yeah. And so when I went through this book, I went through all this in a lot of detail, and I'll explain that in a minute. Yeah. Then Royal Skousen, who's really an awesome researcher and everything, but he's kind of taken a position that Joseph Smith didn't translate it. And I'm going to give you an example here.
Well, if he didn't translate it, then what was he doing? He was basically just reading the words as they appeared on the seer stone.
Well, here's what he said in this book. This is the book where he talks about the King James Bible in the Book of Mormon. And he says here that, let's see, based on the linguistic evidence, the translation must have involved serious intervention from the English language translator, who was not Joseph Smith. So he's teaching now that Joseph Smith didn't really translate the Book of Mormon. Then he says, nonetheless, the text was revealed to Joseph Smith by means of his translation instrument, and he read it off word for word to his scribe. So he's one of several now that say Joseph never really translated anything. He didn't translate the Book of Mormon. There's some of the scholars now say that Joseph Smith didn't even use the plates, for example. Yeah. And so we'll be talking about that.
Is that just semantics, though? When he says that that he translated, I mean, basically, if it comes through the Lord and then through a seer stone in a hat or the Urim and Thummim, is he still having to actually engage his own brain? This is something that I've thought.
Right.
The Lord doesn't usually do that. He doesn't just give things.
Right.
You usually have to do some amount of effort to do that. Yeah. And Joseph Smith, I mean, you've had it in some of your books and so forth, that he spent months in preparation trying to learn other languages and things like that so that he could make an actual, what we'd call a translation, meaning taking a characters from a different language and then turning it into your language. Well,
there's a couple ways to respond to that. First, and that's, again, is going to be a topic in when we talk about D&C 9 and 10 more.
Yeah.
But essentially, the idea is that Joseph didn't translate anything because he was too ignorant to do that. Instead, all he did was he had this seer stone, and he put it into a hat, and words either appeared on the seer stone or in vision, and he just read the words. And that was the quote-unquote translation. And so what they're saying is that when Joseph said...
But that's really a reading, not a translation.
Well, exactly. Yeah. And when he said he translated the Book of Mormon, these scholars now are saying, well, translate doesn't really mean translate the way you and I think about it. It means just reading these words that appeared. And Joseph Smith didn't really know what a translation was anyway. But the thing is, every King James Version Bible, right on the first page, says it's a translation from the original Greek and Latin. I mean, people all knew what a translation was. And
well, the question is also that in the Doctrine and Covenants, these are revelations that Joseph Smith received, and in there numerous times it talks about it being a translation.
Well, in fact, let's look
so at... either Joseph Smith or the Lord didn't know what the word translation means.
Well, let's come back to D&C 1 then. In D&C 1, section 29 is the other one we wanted to talk about. Remember, 24 talked about it being after the manner of their language. In 29 it says, "And after having received the record of the Nephites," which are these plates, although that's only one set of plates.
Yeah, that's one of the sets of plates.
"Yea, even my servant Joseph Smith might have power to translate, through the mercy of God, by the power of God, the Book of Mormon." So he was the translator. It wasn't this mysterious, what I call the mysterious, unknown, supernatural translator that they talk about in here.
And it says his name specifically, Joseph Smith Jr., that he might have power to translate. Yeah.
Right. And it's an important difference, because if Joseph Smith translated the Book of Mormon, then it should be in Joseph Smith's language, after the manner of his language. And so what the scholars are saying is that the language in the Book of Mormon couldn't have been Joseph Smith's language, and therefore he could have been the translator. So it's an important issue for us to understand, and what it led me to realize, by understanding what Joseph Smith's language would consist of, what I call his mental language bank, it allowed me to take a passage of the Book of Mormon and kind of expand it by giving it greater context. In the same way, when I studied Latin and Greek, for example, I studied the Greek New Testament. Yeah. So if you study the New Testament in Greek, you realize there's lots of different ways it could be translated. And there's allusions to Greek literature and things like that involved with it. And so you can really appreciate the New Testament more if you read it in the original language. And now the Book of Mormon, we can draw some more out of it, quite a bit more out of it, by understanding some of the allusions that are in there that aren't obvious. And I'm going to give you lots of examples over the course of this year, also from the Doctrine and Covenants. Yep. So that's an important thing that we're going to talk about. It's one example of the way that we want to provide a supplement to the course material this year that reaffirms the authenticity, the validity, the credibility, the reliability of what Joseph Smith and Oliver Cowdery taught, because what they taught is accurate.
And also what the Lord revealed.
Well, because
numerous times,
right.
I mean, yes.
Right.
Not only did Joseph Smith and Oliver Cowdery talk about it being a translation and using the Urim and Thummim and so forth, but also the Lord himself in about 15 different places here in the Doctrine and Covenants. He also talks about it being a translation and so forth. Yeah.
And I know people say, well, remember we talked about the Book of Commandments and the original Doctrine and Covenants and today's Doctrine and Covenants. And when you go through these, you realize that a lot of the references to the Urim and Thummim were added later. And so that's what people say, well, it wasn't originally the Urim and Thummim. And we'll discuss all that when we get to those sections. But it's important because you really have to realize that the kids today are being taught this stone in the hat thing. And you see it in the videos from other people that are talking about the lesson.
Oh, it's in the page 1 of last year's Book of Mormon. Come Follow Me.
Exactly.
So, as far as the translation process, and it's on the essays and so forth. So it's
my attitude is people can believe whatever they want, and if you want to believe that the Book of Mormon came from the seer stone, that's fine. But for those of you who are skeptical that it would come from a seer stone, we're going to offer you some documentary and historical evidence that Joseph Smith actually used the Urim and Thummim when he translated the Book of Mormon. He didn't use this to translate. That's not to say he didn't use the seer stone, and I'll make the distinction pretty clear, because I think it's obvious he did use the seer stone, but not to translate the Book of Mormon.
It seems odd to me that the Lord would have had the Urim and Thummim basically made, whatever, and then passed down from the Jaredites to the Nephites. The Nephites pass it down through their whole generations until they got it actually put it into the stone box with the actual gold plates in the Hill Cumorah. Also that Joseph Smith could basically just ignore the sacred instrument that God had prepared for the very purpose of translating the Book of Mormon. Instead, he just decided to use this other methodology, because people say, well, he just found it more comfortable.
Yeah, I know. Well, and what we'll point out...
feels weird to me.
Yeah, but again, though, we don't care what people can think whatever they want.
Right. Yeah.
The people that we are hopefully doing this presentation for are people who find this difficult to believe and want to know if there's evidence and prophetic teachings and reasons to believe that what Joseph Smith and Oliver Cowdery said was accurate, and not. Some of the scholars have said, well, when they said Urim and Thummim, they really meant the seer stone, and I'll show you why that isn't even historically possible. So we'll talk about all that. And again, if you're interested, you can read this book. Now, let me just say something about books, because I've written a lot of books.
Yeah.
And I think...
in fact, why don't you take just a couple of minutes and just kind of... you have a plethora of things that you've done here. So, yeah.
The reason I write the books, because I do some podcasts, presentations. I've done lots of them for Rod. I do firesides. I do blogs to kind of describe all this stuff. But most of the time, people ask me, do you have it in a book that they can read, review, check up on? I have, I don't remember how many footnotes in here, but it's...
very substantial.
Yeah, there's 420-something footnotes. So you can go through a book like this, check out the footnotes, the references, and so on, and learn it for yourself, think what you want. But what I'm trying to do is say, if you're skeptical of what some of the scholars are teaching today, I think you're smart, because you shouldn't rely on what scholars say.
What's the overall premise of the book?
Well, the overall premise, the subtitle is Joseph Smith and the Nephite Interpreters. And what I'm saying is that Joseph Smith actually used the Urim and Thummim to translate the Book of Mormon, but it's more than that. like
the Revelations say?
Yeah.
Okay.
But it's more than that, because, as I said, to understand the Book of Mormon as a translation from Joseph Smith, then it allows us to look into what Joseph Smith had in his mind, the words and vocabulary and concepts that were available to him, and we can expand this. A simple example. Book of Mormon talks over and over about the law of Moses, right? But it never says what the law of Moses is. So when I've known people who live in India or China, I've lived in China last year, and other parts of the world that we visited, even in Africa, we lived among Hindu people, and they don't know what the law of Moses is at all. If they read the Book of Mormon, is it a traffic rule, is it what? They don't know what the law of Moses is. And so in order to understand the Book of Mormon, you have to know what the law of Moses is from the Bible. And that's just a simple example we can all relate to. Yeah. There's other passages in the Book of Mormon that are the same way. And one of the best known is the natural man is an enemy to God, right?
Yeah.
And I've looked it up. It's one of the most cited scriptures in General Conference. There's been books and articles written about natural man as an enemy to God. And everybody's speculating about what that means. But if you go back and look at this book by Jonathan Edwards that was published in 1808, it was on sale in the Palmyra bookstore where Joseph Smith went every week to get the newspaper for his father. There's an entire essay in here titled Natural Men Are God's Enemies, and Jonathan Edwards explains how the natural man is an enemy to God. And when you have that background, you don't have to speculate and use a bunch of sophistry to figure out what the Book of Mormon means. You know what it means because of what Jonathan Edwards said. What Jonathan Edwards didn't do was explain how to solve the problem. And the Book of Mormon does that. So it's like the Book of Mormon provides an answer to something that you don't really understand what the question is unless you read the Jonathan Edwards material. And there's many other examples.
And what you're saying is Joseph Smith actually had had exposure to it, maybe had read it himself, or maybe
and his contemporaries also.
Yeah.
And we've lost all that knowledge. It's not even really in our culture anymore. But for those people reading the Book of Mormon, it was like reading the newspaper, as you talked about reading it today. But it's very much a much more profound understanding of the Book of Mormon to have this context. And that's why I think it's important to know that Joseph Smith translated it. It wasn't some mysterious supernatural person who had no access to the plates anyway. I mean,
didn't Joseph Smith also make some changes to his manuscript and so forth? I mean, if he was just reading that, and someone else was behind the curtain, so to speak, and he's just reading off of things how can
Right.
why would he say, well, I made a mistake, or how did, or
Okay,
I didn't have this quite right, or this concept I maybe should have translated it differently.
Yeah, and
That gives
that's
you an indication
that's a
that
good
he
point.
was translating.
And that's a good point, because later on, after he moved to Kirtland and met Frederick G. Williams and became a little better educated about grammar and so on, he also changed the same changes that he made in the Book of Mormon, he made to the early Revelations.
Okay, yeah.
And so changing the word which to whom and so on. And so the same time of grammatical changes that he made in the Book of Mormon, he made in the Doctrine and Covenants.
Yeah.
And that indicates that he knew it was from his own language, his own mental language bank, as I call it. He's making withdrawals from the bank to do the translation.
Yeah.
And so then that gives us an insight into what Joseph was thinking. The other thing that's interesting is, and I didn't mean to get this much into the translation, but we might as well.
Yeah.
When Royal Skousen wrote this book about the King James quotations in the Book of Mormon, this whole book is about the King James quotations and different bits and parts of the King James Bible that show up in the Book of Mormon. What I found is that what he thought were King James references were actually, some of them were actually from Jonathan Edwards instead. And I can show how the Book of Mormon tracks Jonathan Edwards better than it does the Bible.
Oh, wow.
And that's because Jonathan Edwards was talking about the Bible, and he quoted the Bible. But in many cases, Jonathan Edwards would paraphrase or misquote the Bible when he was speaking or writing.
And that's what ended up in...
That's what ends up in the Book of Mormon. It's not the original. And it's awesome when you see it. I mean, you'll see it's really cool. So I have about 2,000 pages of notes on all this stuff.
So John Smith was drawing from his knowledge,
Right.
the information that he had read or ingested, basically, and into his mind. So
Yeah. Well, anyone
that's where he was drawing it from.
Anyone who translates a manuscript from one language to another, the only words you can use are the ones that are in your head, right?
Right.
And that's how Joseph Smith did it. And here's another reason why this is so important. The critics, the people like C.E.S. Letter and so on, they all say, they find these examples.
Jeremy Reynolds. Yeah.
Jeremy Reynolds or, John Deland and Mormon Stories. Some of those critics find books like The Late War, and they say, well, look, some of the language in here is like the Book of Mormon, therefore Joseph Smith must have copied it. And they talk about View of the Hebrews, for example.
Right. Yep. That's another one.
And my response, which I discuss in this book, is that evidence of composition is also evidence of translation. It's the same evidence. It'd be exactly the same if Joseph Smith composed the Book of Mormon or if he translated the Book of Mormon. It would look exactly the same in terms of language. The difference is...
Because he doesn't have... If there's words that are in the book that are not in his language bank, he's not going to be able to use that word. So he's only going to pull out the words that he knows.
Right.
Yeah.
So the Lord and even the Holy Ghost, or the scriptures talk about how the Holy Ghost will bring things to your memory, right?
Right.
So it'll pull language out of your head, but it's not going to insert new words in your head, So the reason this is all important is if we understand that Joseph Smith translated the Book of Mormon, then all the critics who give other indications that Joseph composed it, they're just showing that he translated it. And the difference between composition and translation is the indicia of antiquity that are in the Book of Mormon that couldn't have been composed.
Right.
Some of that's chiasmus, although I think chiasmus is a little overdone. And Jonathan Edwards talked about all that biblical parallelism and stuff too.
Oh, really? Wow.
But there's other things in there that are kind of between the lines that are from antiquity that neither Joseph nor his contemporaries could have known. And we'll talk about some of those. It's awesome. But
Yeah.
that's why it's important for people to know that Joseph didn't sit there and compose the Book of Mormon. There's a book out now that is from a former member of the church. And he believes that Joseph Smith composed it as a kind of a mental, not exercise, but there's...
Gymnastics or something?
Yeah, well, just that he composed it the way people tell these long stories, that he would just dictate a long story, and he had little mnemonic devices so he could remember what was next and so on. And when you read that guy's analysis of it, it kind of makes sense if you don't know that Joseph translated it. And that's why I think it's so important to not rely on this stone in the hat stuff, because the stone in the hat stuff is, if you rely on the stone in the hat, there's really no way to distinguish that between just pure imagination, fiction, and what the critics say Joseph Smith saw in The Stone in the Hat. And that's why I felt like it was important to explain it in detail and write it. Knowing that Joseph Smith translated the Book of Mormon supports the evidence that we've talked about in terms of the book, but even more importantly, it reaffirms that Joseph Smith told the truth. Because as soon as you start saying, well, yeah, we know he said he translated it, we know he said he translated with the Nephite interpreters, with the Urim and Thummim, but he didn't really. He just read it off the Stone in the Hat. As soon as you say that, then it's difficult to accept anything he said, right?
Yeah, and you're going to get into, later on, you'll get into the reasons why the Stone in the Hat thing even was originally kind of brought up. It had to do with some of the early books and so forth, and demonstration.
Right.
There's a few other books that you haven't really mentioned about here while you're at it.
Okay.
But you have it right here. Do you want to?
Okay, yeah, I'll just talk about them real quickly. And these are my church history books, so they'll come in subsequent weeks and months. Yeah. This one is called "Whatever Happened to the Golden Plates," and it talks about the two different.
Mind blowing, by the way.
Yeah,
awesome.
This is really cool. and in fact, I have a book that I don't have here because the printer didn't give it to me yet. But it's called "Between These Hills." It's a case for the New York Cumorah, where I'm saying that no, the Hill Cumorah really is in New York. It's not down somewhere in Mexico. And in order to understand that, you have to understand that there are these two different sets of plates. That's what this book is about. Yeah. Okay, we'll talk about that in a few weeks. The other ones there? There's another one here called Letter 7. And in terms of church history, this is interesting because in 1834 and 1835, Oliver Cowdery wrote 8 essays with the assistance of Joseph Smith, he made very clear, that were the first published church history. And for decades, but at least until Joseph Smith's history was published in 1842. So for about 8 years, it was the only history of the church in print anywhere, and everybody refered to it. And
Joseph Smith loved it so much, and because he helped with it, he actually had it republished over and over and over again. Every publication that Joseph Smith had access to be able to publish in, he published these letters.
He had it republished. Yeah. And it's even in his journal, so you can read it in the Joseph Smith papers, which we can provide a link for that. Yeah. But it's important because he talks a lot in more detail about Moroni's visit, what Moroni told Joseph Smith on the very first visit, the scriptures that he quoted. Remember, in Joseph Smith history, he says, well, he quoted from Malachi and a few things, but I don't have time to get the rest of them. Well, that's because the rest of them were already in these letters, and they had been published in the Times and Seasons the year before, so everybody knew what they were. So he didn't have to repeat it. Then, it's pretty cool. It's pretty awesome. And then I wrote, the first book I did on church history is called Lost City of Zarahemla, and we'll get into that when we talk about Nauvoo period in 1842.
Yeah, speaking of people and the words that they use, incontrovertible.
Right. Yeah, that's another one.
One of those words that was used by a guy that helped identify him a little bit, in that it's not a word that was typically used back in even those days or even now too much, and helped you to identify who the author was of some of this information there.
Right. Yeah. So we'll talk about that later on in the year. This is, as we indicated, just like DNC 1 is the Lord's preface to the Doctrine and Covenants. This session right now is the preface for the whole year's worth of Come Follow Me.
Yep.
And I don't need to get into the rest of these right now, but we'll save these
just
for
briefly
later.
touch on Moroni's America, because that's the.
This is the one Rod likes because it talks about the Book of Mormon. Geography a little bit.
I'm a little stuck on the Book of Mormon stuff. Yeah.
Yeah, a little bit. So this was the one I did that discusses goes through the Book of Mormon and discusses the geography based on my premise that the Hill Cumorah is in New York. And I started off saying, okay, I'm going to, just for fun, I'm going to try something. I'm going to assume that Joseph Smith and Oliver Cowdery told the truth. It's kind of a new idea in some circles, but I just assumed that they did. If the Hill Cumorah is in New York, how does the Book of Mormon describe the geography? And so I went through the verses and...
Actually, chapter by chapter.
Chapter by chapter. To see how it kind of fit. And I was surprised how well it fit.
Yeah, it's just awesome. It's phenomenal. Yeah.
So if you're interested in that was kind of last year's topic in the Book of Mormon.
Yep.
But this year we're talking about church history, which starts with the translation of the Book of Mormon. I mean, the first vision, but the first vision by itself didn't do anything. It was, the Lord knew that he had to provide this Book of Mormon scripture from the America, the Promised Land, and so on. So that's why that's important still to church history.
Yeah.
But again, let's just look one more time at verse 29 with that long explanation and read it again now in that context. After having received the record of the Nephites, which was the plates,
Yep.
even my servant Joseph Smith might have power to translate through the mercy of God, by the power of God, the Book of Mormon. And so I believe, anyway, that it was Joseph Smith who translated the Book of Mormon. A better way to say it is he translated the record of the Nephites into the Book of Mormon. And that's kind of a core point, I guess. When I was a missionary, we used to tell people that. Missionaries today have to go out and tell people that he read a stone in a hat. I mean, I don't know about you, but I don't know how well that goes over. And it's too bad.
I haven't been telling people that.
Yeah, no, I know, but they have had to, yeah. And so what I'm hoping is, again, as I said at the beginning, people can believe whatever they want.
Yeah.
But if you're having trouble accepting this stone in the hat stuff, you have good reason to have trouble with it, and we're going to discuss as we go through the Doctrine and Covenants ways that you can understand how Joseph and Oliver really did tell the truth, and they were very accurate and specific in what they talked about.
And to me, that's probably the most important thing. I mean, people are going to have different beliefs and so forth, but what is the truth? Because ultimately, you can believe in the Easter Bunny, and sorry in case I blew it for somebody, but you can believe in the Easter Bunny, but that doesn't make them real, right?
Yeah.
So, but you have to at some point in time find what the truth is, and when you can find the truth, then it says then that makes you free,
right?
And instead of being bound down by false philosophies and ideas that are incorrect, the truth actually is very liberating,
right,
when you find it.
And we feel like, but again, people might think there's truth in this too. So I don't want to say everybody else is wrong, we're right. That's not what we're saying at all. That's not even our objective. Our objective only is to support those people who still believe what Joseph Smith and Oliver said. And there's a lot of people that don't, that are active, faithful members of the church, and that's fine. But the ones who have problems with the new narratives are the ones that we are addressing and supporting and helping with.
Give them a reason for the faith that is in them.
That's right. That's right.
As they say.
Yeah.
I'm just going to finish up with just one of my personal favorite things. That's not a favorite necessarily, but it's one of my things I'd like to bring up is just how many people have sacrificed to bring these truths to light.
Right. Good point.
So from Joseph Smith and all the persecutions and so forth that he did, and then writing these things down, and Oliver Cowdery and helping to write these things down as well, we wouldn't have the Book of Commandments. Really, in fact, it's the most if you had an original copy of the Book of Commandments, it's the most expensive thing. It's far more expensive than an original copy of the Book of Mormon, because they're far more rare.
Yeah.
But the Book of Commandments is interesting because you had those other pages there. Obviously, these were
we're going to talk
pages
about that
that were going to be.
That section,
but I just was going to mention about one of the sacrifices was this Mary Elizabeth Rollins.
Yeah.
And her sister Caroline, who when the mobs basically were taking the printing press out there in the Independence area, and destroying the press, that they were printing the Book of Commandments on. This is the reason why there's so few actual copies of it. They threw the press out in the street and so forth, and these two young ladies, young girls really, and they gathered up what they could find out in the street, apparently, that had been thrown out of the window there of the second story and down onto the ground, and they gathered them up, and the mob came after them basically, and they hid it, I guess, in their dresses or something like that, ran out into this cornfield. And they were basically being hunted, and they would have been killed had they been caught. But they basically made that sacrifice, and that because of them, we have some of those revelations that were published and printed and so forth. So I just like to make that's a little a little bit of a background as far as some of the other people who've made sacrifices to bring this book forth. Well, everybody, I hope you've enjoyed this. It's been great. Jonathan, thank you for coming here and being here on your Christmas vacation. Some of these we're going to probably end up doing Zoom calls between here and, what did you say, the Promised Land of Oregon?
It's up there in Zion.
Anyway, so thank you for everybody. I hope you're going to be able to join us. we are excited about this. We weren't sure if we're going to actually do this because this is kind of out of our wheelhouse a little bit, but actually we have so many really wonderful people, and there's a lot of great information here. And we'll probably have a little bit of a Book of Mormon slant to it. I'm just going to warn you just right off because there's such an interconnection between the Book of Mormon and early church history, and a lot of things that were going on there. So, let me just end with one last thing, okay?
Yes. Yep. So the last verses 37 and 38 here in section 1 are very crucial to this whole discussion. 37 says, "Search these commandments." It doesn't say glance through them. It doesn't say use them as a quote book. It doesn't say just read them once in a while, once every 4 years, right?
Yeah.
It says search these commandments. How do you search the commandments? Yeah. This Sunday or Monday, I'm doing a fireside on how to study church history. But you don't have to read all these references to search the commandments. You can search them by actually reading them, cross-referencing to the Bible, and thinking and pondering about them. That's an important part of searching, is to be prayerful about them, to ponder the teachings and how it applies in your life. And he says, search these commandments, for they are true and faithful. And now, true and faithful, think about that. When it talks in here about Joseph translating the Book of Mormon with the Urim and Thummim.
That's true.
Right there. That's true and faithful. Even if they were edited later, just like the Book of Mormon was, it doesn't mean it wasn't true and faithful. It says they're true and faithful. Yeah. And the prophecies and promises which are in them shall all be fulfilled. And we want to understand those prophecies and promises, which is an interesting title of a book, by the way. Then the next one is...
Yes, it is.
What I, the Lord, have spoken, I have spoken. Right there. Why do we have to say that what's in the Doctrine and Covenants is the wrong word or means something other than it means? Yeah. What I have spoken, I have spoken. I excuse not myself. And though the heavens and the earth pass away, my word shall not pass away, but shall all be fulfilled, whether by mine own voice or by the voice of my servants. It's the same. So I think we need to recognize that the commandments the Lord has told us to search here are what we should stick with, not what some scholar says. No matter how erudite, how many members of the credentialed class write about this stuff, that's not what we've been asked to search and study. We've been asked to search these commandments. And that's what our focus here during these podcasts is going to be, on what the Scriptures actually say. And then the last one, for behold and lo, the Lord is God, and the Spirit beareth record, and the record is true, and the truth abideth forever and ever. That's our testimony, and that's how we feel about what we're going to be talking about this year.
Yeah. In fact, the definition, the very definition of truth is things as they are, as they were, and as they will be, basically. The past, present, and future. Yep. That's why it's so important that we search out these truths and these commandments and take the Scriptures and what the prophets have said as our first line of defense and information, and other additional information and things like these podcasts and other information is all great. But if it doesn't line up with what the Scriptures say, you can know that it's not correct.
Yeah. So our intention is to help you all search the Scriptures. Yeah. That's our whole. We don't have an agenda here other than that. So anyway, great to be with you.
Thank you, Jonathan. Appreciate that. We're looking forward to a great year with the Doctrine and Covenants and the Pearl of Great Price. And so we will see you next week, folks.
Okay.
Take care.
Bye.
To me, this is not just another nation. It is not just one of the family of nations. This is a nation with a great mission to perform for the benefit of liberty-loving people everywhere. It is my firm conviction that the Constitution of this land was established by men whom the God of heaven raised up unto that very purpose. This is part of my religious faith.
Get the very latest edition of the Annotated Book of Mormon available now in the bookstore at bookofmormonevidence.org.